Hi, welcome. I'm sorry I'm looking at my paper, but thank you for joining me today to talk about some of the most common questions I get asked about clinical trials for patients with cancer. I am Dr. Bill Small. I'm professor and chair of the Department of Radiation Oncology at Loyola University Chicago, and also the director of the Cardinal Bernardin Cancer Center. I'm filming at the Living Well Cancer Resource Center. Living Well offers greater than 100 free programs and services to cancer patients and their family. I thought I'd just start off giving you some background on myself and some background on Living Well. So I am currently, like I said, at Loyola. I spent 26 years at Northwestern downtown before I switched over to Loyola in 2013. I've been associated with Living Well since near its start, as helping with some of the program stuff and some of the scientific aspects of the programs, and I'm really truly proud to be part of Living Well, as it does some great things for the community. And if this is new to anybody, once they're back open, please stop by, and before that, please use their virtual stuff they've been doing. I think it's fantastic. So my goal today is to talk about clinical trials, and I'll give you some background on myself when it comes to clinical trials. So I've been a clinical trialist and a basic scientist for my whole career. I've been PI or co-PI of national and international trials. I'm associated with some of the NIH clinical trial units. I'm the co-chair of NRG Oncology Gynae Committee. I've done clinical trial work for a long time. I think it's incredibly important for promoting cancer care. And I guess one of the first things, I did ask my wife what I should talk about, and she says sometimes I talk too over people's heads. So I apologize if some of this stuff is too basic. But clinical trials are simply the only way we really make progress in cancer care. We have different phases of clinical trials, which I'll talk a little bit about. But a typical big advance in cancer care comes through a clinical trial. So let's just say we come up with a new treatment for cancer. It's usually tested in the lab and often with animal work, and it shows some promise. So you've got a new drug X, that's going to make some type of cancer disappear. And the most common recent things, and I know you've had a Living Well live Facebook by my friend Dr. Bayer on immunotherapy. That's probably one of the more common new treatments for cancer that's come on into play. Every single one of those drugs went through a clinical trials, and clinical trials have kind of phases to them, if you've ever heard that. Phase 1 means that it's a new treatment or drug that we've never used before in a human. So it's people just starting off getting them. You've seen probably some of that with the COVID vaccines. You've got to make sure it's safe. So the only aspect of that trial is to make sure the drug is safe, although we're all hoping that it works well. So phase 1 trials are usually first in human trials. The next step is a phase 2 trial. And a phase 2 trial is taking a bunch of people and giving them this new therapy and hoping and trying to see if it actually has a signal that it may work. So you have 100 patients with some type of cancer, you give them this drug and you look at how they did with this drug and find out that, maybe it did improve outcome. Maybe this is something we should move forward. And the ultimate trial, which is the trial we all try to do, is a phase 3 trial. A phase 3 trial is a flip of a coin trial. That means a patient goes on a clinical study, signs a consent, gets informed what they're going to do, and then a computer basically decides what arm of the trial they're on, what type of treatment they get. It's the best way to determine if a treatment really is useful and really is beneficial for the patient. Why are those trials important? They're important because sometimes we get fooled. We get fooled with treatments that we think would work very well, and then when we test them in a big study, sometimes they don't work as well as we thought, or even they're harmful. So I think if we can, in a lot of trials, phase 3 trials are really something that is important and is very, very altruistic of the people that go on these trials. I can't say enough about patients that agree to clinical trials as the only way to move cancer treatment forward. I'm just looking at my notes. I apologize about that. There are really two major types of clinical trials. One's an academic clinical trial. An academic clinical trial is a trial that no one's going to get rich off of. It's just done purely for the science of it. Most of those trials, not all of them, are done in academic centers. I'll give an example of a trial that I'm currently doing that's purely academic. I treat a lot of endometrial cancer, and we do something called brachytherapy. Brachytherapy is putting radiation into the patient temporarily to reduce the risk of the cancer coming back. So we're doing a simple trial looking at 2 doses versus 4 doses, hoping that we can get away with 2 doses because it's better for the patients. That's a typical academic trial. The outcomes will help patients, but there's no profit or new indication involved in that trial. Then there's industry-sponsored trials. Industry-sponsored trials are drug companies are coming up with a new drug to treat a cancer, and then they sponsor the clinical trial. That's where most of the new drugs come from, are industry-sponsored trials. Those are kind of the 2 basic trials. For patients, it's pretty transparent which trial you're on. Why do you do a clinical trial? It's a great question. There are probably 2 major reasons to do clinical trials. One is often the new treatments we're trying to bring to patients are only first offered on a clinical trial. So we've got all the new immunotherapy agents, all the new chemotherapies, all the new radiation techniques were first done on a clinical trial that you could only get on that clinical trial. So sometimes it gives you access to a drug or a treatment that you would not otherwise have access to. So there are some direct potential benefits to being on that study. And it often makes me kind of odd at people and patients, because probably the only other reason to be on a trial is really to help your fellow mankind. So there's a lot of things that are done that we know may not have a significant direct benefit for the patient, but may make a new treatment much more accepted and a new standard of care. I'll give you an example of that. It wasn't that long ago that everyone with breast cancer had a mastectomy. And even everyone with breast cancer had a radical mastectomy, which means taking off muscle, and it was very deforming. And there was some ideas that maybe we didn't need to do that. Maybe we can do a smaller surgery, a lumpectomy, and give radiation afterwards to kill any cancer cells left behind. And maybe that was as good, maybe even better than doing mastectomy, or at least as good. So there were 6 well-done flip-of-a-coin trials around the world that women let a computer decide if they were going to have a mastectomy or a lumpectomy. And that really determined that breast conservation, if you're an appropriate candidate, was a very good therapy for breast cancer. And that's an example of, I think, patients actually being somewhat very altruistic and knowing that they're going to give back to society if the study proves important. I was asked, and I think this is reasonable, clinical trials in the aspect of COVID. We, cancer directors around Chicago since early March have been meeting every Sunday. We have a conference call to discuss COVID care. It's a rapidly moving subject in the sense that things change on a daily basis, and I know that you've had a discussion already about COVID and cancer, and I won't go too far into that. I would say that there's 2 aspects to COVID and cancer that I would talk about. One is we are doing a number of trials that traditional cancer care is being used in the COVID era. For example, we may participate in giving radiation to patients' lungs who have a pneumonia with COVID. So that is one aspect of COVID and cancer, is using some of the therapies we use in cancer on COVID patients and seeing if we can help slow or prevent or stop the process of the COVID infection. The other is, what do we do about COVID patients in clinical trials? Are they still eligible for clinical trials? Do we test for it? I think that's still a work in progress. Right now, testing, as you know, has been ramped up significantly. Most of us are able to get testing for patients who are symptomatic a lot easier now than we did a month ago. There are some more drive-up sites being done. We are also moving to testing asymptomatic patients that are starting chemotherapy or new cytotoxic treatments. If someone has a COVID infection, we are worried when we give immunosuppressive therapy that they may have more side effects. So I think that in most clinical trials, it says don't do the trial if you have an active infection. So I think that is something that we're much more keen to now than we were before COVID. I would say that it's something we think about with each cancer patient we put on a clinical trial, but I don't think we think much differently than that, than just standard care. So how do you find a clinical trial? That's another great question. There's probably a few different ways to find a clinical trial. First of all, I think patients need to be their own advocates. I think Living Well does a great job supporting advocacy for the patients. So doing your own investigation is always good. there's a website that maybe we can put up. It's https :// And at clinicaltrials.gov, you can go there and find out all the clinical trials that are happening out throughout the United States that may fit your particular cancer type and performance status and all the other aspects of putting people on trial. Certainly ask your physician. They should know what clinical trials are available. Each institution has its own clinical trials. So a trial may be available at one center, might not be available at another center. It is a fairly detailed process, and most centers will have websites that have what clinical trials are available. So I think that doing some investigation, if you're interested in it, it's always a good thing. Any clinical trials on the horizon, any new clinical trials, there are literally thousands of clinical trials on the horizon. We are a plethora of new ideas. So I think that, again, the therapies that are really being pushed a lot is immunotherapy, having your body fight the cancer itself by manipulating it a little bit. There's new therapies in treating metastatic disease with radiation. There's a lot of new clinical trials on the horizon that I think it's so broad it's a hard question to give a specific answer for. Got a couple other COVID questions. Current information on COVID antibody testing for cancer patients, and what does it mean? I don't know yet. I think we're still in the process of deciding what that means. We have to make sure we have a COVID antibody test that truly shows that you truly had an infection. And we don't know yet what that means of whether you're permanently immune to it or not. So I think in common clinical practice, we're not necessarily using that now. We're still using whether you have an active infection and trying not to treat people with cytotoxic therapies that have an active infection. Why is it taking so long to get a COVID vaccine? Generally, it takes years to do a vaccine. If you're going to inject people with something, you want to make sure it's incredibly safe. So you not only have to make sure it's safe, that would be the phase 1 part of the trial, just like with cancer trials. And those are being done where people are volunteering to get injected to make sure there's not a bad problem with the vaccine. But then you have to make sure you have an immune response to it, that you make antibodies to it, and that those antibodies are capable of preventing the infection. If we can do a vaccine in a year or so, that would be fantastic. That would be quicker than I've ever seen in the past. And I think that's about all I had for opening remarks. I know we got a couple questions from the audience, and if it's okay with my hosts, I will answer them. One question, which came from James B. Are there any clinical trials underway at Northwestern Memorial regarding HIFU, high-intensity focused ultrasound for prostate cancer? I would tell you I'm not incredibly familiar since I left Northwestern a few years ago what's available at Northwestern, but I am familiar with HIFU. I think the best way to do that is what I think you just tweeted out, which is the clinicaltrials.gov. That should be able, you can actually just type in your tumor type, what you're interested in. It should pop up. Most centers will put their trials through cancertrials.gov and should tell you where there might be studies on HIFU. From Ravi, do you know if there are any clinical trials for patients with stage 4 bladder cancer who have completed the initial 18 weeks of chemotherapy and may require additional treatments in the future? Off the top of my head, not specifically, but I guarantee you there's trials for advanced bladder cancer in clinicaltrials.gov. So the three ways of doing that is, one is asking your physician if they have any trials that are available there, going to your hospital institution's websites, and usually if you type clinical trials, it'll pop up what trials they have available. And then again, clinicaltrials.gov will have available throughout the country trials that might be available for your particular interest. Another kind of background thing that I didn't mention, who should be on which cancer patient should be on a clinical trial? I feel very strongly that every patient should be on a clinical trial. In pediatric oncology, we have made remarkable strides in how we treat pediatric patients. Literally, almost every pediatric patient goes directly on a clinical trial. I think that we need to do a better job having the breadth of clinical trials and having the appropriate clinical trials for each person. In the adult population, a relatively small amount of patients go on clinical trials. So who should be on them? I think everybody. I could answer some of these questions, or if you have any from the audience, I will go through some more questions that I have. How is a patient's safety checked during a clinical trial? It's a very good question. So in order for an institution to do a clinical trial, that trial must go through something called an institutional review board, which means it's a board that's composed of physicians, lay people, patient advocates, that looks at every clinical trial specifically to see if that trial has a patient's best interest in mind and safety in mind. So a trial goes through a number of checks and balances before it ever gets approved and opened. So for the national academic trials, there are literally 20 committees that look through the trial, including a national and often a local IRB that looks through the trial before it's ever accepted that you can actually be on the study. During the study, then, the data that comes about is looked at by both the IRB and sometimes something called a Data Safety Monitoring Committee, which I chaired when I was at Northwestern, which looks at the data of the trials to make sure things are safe and the trial should continue or be closed. I was happy to see Dr. Fauci, I forget what's his last name. Who's our COVID? Dr. Fauci? Fauci. Actually talk about a Data Safety Monitoring Committee. It came into play with Remdesivir, the new drug that has recently been approved for use for COVID. That was a very large clinical trial, 1,000 patients, where they flipped a coin between giving the drug or giving a placebo. That's the cleanest trial to be done, where you can look at both right head to head. And it was being monitored by a Data Safety Monitoring Committee. They were the only ones that saw the data. And they saw that the data was showing that giving the drug was significantly better than not giving a drug for the primary endpoint for the trial, which was days in the hospital. So the Data Safety Monitoring Committee closed the study early because they felt it was unethical to continue because it was showing a benefit to the patients. Data Safety Monitoring Boards, IRBs, will also do the same thing if the drug or treatment seems too toxic or it's not going to work. So Data Safety Monitoring Boards will also stop a trial if the trial is never going to help because it doesn't seem to be showing any indication of improving the outcome. So there are a number of safety things that are in every single clinical trial, and safety is paramount to anybody being on a study. Will I know if I'm taking the experimental treatment? That's a great question. Not every treatment is placebo-controlled. So, for example, my particular profession is radiation. Very few times will we give fake radiation where you lie under a machine and the machine's not on. So if we're doing a trial between radiation or not radiation, and the radiation is the experimental arm, you'll know it. There are certain trials where you get IV medications, and again, putting people through IV medications when they're not actually getting a trial sometimes doesn't happen. So sometimes you will absolutely know whether you're on the experimental arm. Many times you won't. So a lot of trials that are pill trials, one might be an active treatment, one might be an inactive treatment. So what's something called a double-blind trial is probably the cleanest trial, and double-blind means both the person that's giving you the drug and you don't know what it is. So no one can artificially be subjective about what's going on. Who can I speak with about questions I have during and after a trial? Every study consent, you should get a copy of it, and the copy will have a number and a person that you can contact at any time about the study. So there should be a clear person. It's usually the principal investigator for the study that you can contact at all times. Who will be in charge of my care, and will I be able to see my own doctor? Who is in charge of your care? You're in charge of your care. I think that a patient is in charge of whatever they do. Being on a trial doesn't mean you can't stop the trial, that you can't change a trial. Will you have your own doctor? You're always going to have your own doctor. Sometimes people will go to an institution for a trial, so that person that's putting you on the study will usually work closely with your local physician to coordinate the care. So it kind of depends on whether your own doctor is giving you the study drug or if you're going to someplace else. But no one's ever excluded from being part of your care. And again, you're in charge of your care. will I have to pay for any of the treatments of tests in a trial? The short answer is only if they're not standard of care. So most clinical trials go through what's called a Medicare coverage analysis, which is where I write a study that I want to do to give drug X, and I then send it to somebody that goes through and decides all the tests and all the scans and all the drugs that are given per the trial, are they standard of care? If they're standard of care, then they're billed just to insurance or billed as they normally would. If they're not, then yes, most of the trials will pay for those non-standard of care treatments. What happens if I decide to leave the trial? It's always your decision to leave the trial. You can leave the trial. You can sign a consent, come in and about to get the treatment, decide not to do it. That's okay. That's part of the deal with the trial. It's not, certainly we don't want people signing up for a trial that don't think they want to be on it, but you can leave the trial at any time and get standard treatment at any time, and there's no repercussions to it. It's your decision at any time to stay or be on the trial. And I think that's about all the pre-questions I had. Does any questions come in that?
Yes, Kathleen is asking, is it true that cancers that are less common have fewer trials? If so, what can be done about that?
It's a great question. I'll repeat it just in case. Does the sound come in pretty well? I'll repeat it. Kathleen asked, is it true that cancers that are less common have less clinical trials? And if there is so, what can be done about it? I'm the past chair of something called the Gynecological Cancer Intergroup, and that's a group that people that do gynecological trials throughout the world, they are part of. So the U.S. clinical trials are part of it. Asia, Europe, Australia, China, all are part of this group. And we had committees called rare tumor committees because you can't really do a study on a rare tumor in one country. So it is very true that there's less studies. So one of the things we can do about it is try to collaborate throughout the world. And what I would suggest, what people can do is advocate to reduce those barriers. Sometimes governmental agents and regulations have a little bit difficult time going across countries. So one of the things we do for rare tumors is do more international collaboration. There are some processes through the NCI for actual funding for rare tumors, and there are a lot of independent foundations that try to look at rare tumors because they don't quite get the publicity that more common tumors do. And one of the real issues about that too is that if you're a biotech company trying to find a new drug and trying to pay for the research and development, it's hard to research and develop a rare tumor. So I think that some governments have tried to give specific funding. We try to do things throughout the world and try to advocate for funding and support for rare tumors. I think those are all things that we could try to do.
April is on a clinical trial and is asking whose responsibility is it in the trial to help the patient through pain as a side effect?
So April, just to repeat it, April asked, she's on a clinical trial and asked whose responsibility is it to help the patient through pain through the trial. The treating physician is always the person, the treating physician, their team should always be the person helping with pain. I think that being on a trial should not be you are not getting the absolute best supportive care you can get. So the answer would be talk to the physician you're being treated with and try to work out your pain. That should have nothing to do with the trial. No one should be withholding any pain medication because you're on a trial.
The question comes up. We know the NCI sponsors clinical trials,
right,
but there's still a cost associated outside of that. So from an organizational standpoint, who absorbs that cost or how is that cost offset?
That's a great question. And one of the hard things about doing clinical trials, the NCI, so there's, like I started off saying, there's two sponsors of clinical trials. There's academic clinical trials, which are either NCI, National Cancer Institute, and in other countries have similar kind of governmental agencies that sponsor clinical trials, or philanthropy can sponsor clinical trials. So non-commercial trials are sponsored by generally NCI or organizations like that, foundations, or institutions. I sponsor some of my own trials with our philanthropic money. Unfortunately, every time I put a patient on an NCI clinical trial, we lose money. because it does not reimburse the amount that it costs for me to put someone on trial. So at our institution, the institution itself supports it a little bit. We try to get philanthropy. For the patient, we don't put on trials that patients will have to pay more than the standard treatment. So for example, the study that we're doing with MD Anderson, University of Utah, where we're giving 2 versus 4 fractions, that's all being billed to insurance. The standard is 4. Actually, if you're on the trial and get the experimental arm, you'll get less treatment. So the answer is twofold. One is for the patient, we try not to put patients on trials where it would cost them more than it would cost them for standard care. It still costs because it's still treatments, so you still have to pay for the standard parts of that's standard parts of care, going back to that Medicare coverage analysis. And then when it comes to institutions, we rely on philanthropy, grants, foundations, things like that to cover the cost.
Annette is a cancer patient, and she is on leave from work because her oncologist feels it's too risky for her to return to work.
Sure.
She's asking if she'll ever be able to return to work with coronavirus, or is it going to be dependent when there's a vaccine?
And that's a great question. The question is, her doc wants her to stay home because he thinks it's too risky to be exposed to coronavirus, which is a question we get every day, and it's an excellent question. Will it ever be able to be? The answer is, I believe the answer is almost a definitive yes. When the risk is low enough that your physician thinks you can be in public as an individual discussion between you and your physician, that is something that I think will be different for different people. When it comes to when will we not have to worry about COVID virus, though I wish I knew the magic wand to say it would go away. I think that it'll either go away for 2 reasons. One, we'll get a vaccine, which I truly believe we will get a vaccine. If we get a vaccine that works well enough, it'll go away at that point. Or we'll get something called herd immunity, which means enough of us will get it that eventually the vaccine can't survive outside the body. So once enough people are immune to it, the virus will simply go away.
No more questions?
All right. Well, I thank you for spending a few minutes. I'm happy to have my contact information posted if anyone has any questions or wants to email me, or I'm happy to respond. Okay. Thank you very much. Have a great day.